Good evening. Keir Starmer has described the decision to spare 3 teenage boys' custodial sentences for the rape of 2 girls as appalling. Ministry of Justice figures show that more than 38,000 offenders were subject to an emergency release scheme between September 2024 and June 2025 in order to ease prison crowding. Brian Booth, the Deputy National Chairman of the Police Federation, says that the police will become caretakers in the community for criminals under Labour's justice reforms. Well, let's speak about this with Chris Daw KC. Chris is a criminal barrister at Millennium Chambers and author of the book Justice on Trial, and he joins us on the line now. Hello, Chris.
Good evening. I'm definitely not a millennial.
Brian Booth of the Police Federation says that there's a growing gap between the sentence handed down in court and the reality experienced by the victim. Should a judge take the reality experienced by a victim into account?
To a degree, yes, in the sense that judges need to understand how victims feel and how they're impacted by crime, but not to the extent that the victim's feelings dictate the sentence that's imposed by the judge, because we don't live in a system where individual members of our society who've been victims of crime can choose the punishment for the criminal. We live in a system where we apply the law equally and fairly and justly across the whole of our society in all cases with the same standards. And so some victims, for example, I've been involved in cases where victims have said they don't want the perpetrator to go to prison. They have very strong religious beliefs, they believe in redemption, they believe in forgiveness, and they don't want the person to go to prison. And the judge has to say, I'm sorry, I can't avoid sending the person to prison because my public duty and the law requires me to do that. And it has to be the same the other way around.
Yes, the other way round would probably lead to massive sentences for all crimes because victims will quite possibly want revenge, and that's not what the criminal justice system is about, is it?
Well, it's not supposed to be about that, but that's what it's about in the United States, which is why they have a prison population of about 2.5 million, where sentences are imposed because politicians impose sentence guidelines which require judges to send people to prison for minimum amounts of time for every single crime, which means that you end up with a prison population, as I've just said, of 2.5 million. Now, our prison population is approaching 100,000, which is an extraordinary number. But when you think of the United States population is only, it's 5 times bigger than ours, and yet their prison population is over 25 times the size of ours, that's where you end up when you put victims in charge of sentencing and you put sentencing in effect in the hands of politicians responding to media opinion and public opinion in a very visceral and guttural way.
Yes, the American system is somewhat bizarre. It's a for-profit prison system, isn't it? So it almost encourages the jailing of people for...
Yes, I mean, it's interesting. So you mentioned at the introduction, I wrote a book called Justice on Trial, and in the course of that book, or in the course of researching that book, I went to prisons in the United States, and one of them was a prison in Alabama where I walked through the prison, and we walked through this enormous industrial kitchen which had phenomenal equipment and so forth. And I said, well, there's nobody in here, it's empty. And they said, no, because the governor has done a deal, or the local authorities have done a deal with a commercial food company that sends food in plastic packets every day at 47 cents or whatever for breakfast, and they make profit out of that. And so the kitchens sit empty, the prisoners sit in their cells 23 hours a day and eat plastic food. I mean, that's how far it goes when you take the whole lock people away forever but spend nothing on them when they're in there to its extreme.
Yes, but some people would actually welcome the latter part of what you just said, locking people up forever. I mean, jailing ever more people lessens crime if you don't let them out.
It doesn't. No, not well, only in the sense that if you have exponential growth in your prison population. So one statistic that interests me extraordinarily is that 1/3 of the male adult population of this country has a criminal conviction. So that's 1 in 3 men has a criminal conviction. Now, that is tens of millions of people. So if we take the view that everyone who commits a crime is a terrible person and we should lock them away and throw away the key, That's a lot of people, and that's a lot of prison places. And each of those prison places costs £50,000 a year of our money, taxpayers' money. So, okay, let's do it, but who's going to pay for it?
America jails more of its population as a per head than any Western nation, and we jail more of our population than any country in Western Europe, and yet America has an out-of-control crime problem, and compared to much of the rest of Europe, so do we. It almost seems counterintuitively that locking people up makes the situation worse.
Well, it's not counterintuitive at all, because if you understand anything about how criminal justice works, this is a big chapter in my book, is why we should stop locking people in prison, full stop. We should definitely restrict the movement of dangerous people. But the minute you lock someone in prison, what you do is create two things. One, a massive amount of public expenditure. So tens of thousands a year, as I've just said, to keep them in that place. So a nurse who's paying her taxes on a salary of, 35,000 is paying taxes to keep people at 50,000 a year in a prison when they should be potentially in many cases in a psychiatric hospital. In many other cases, they should be in a rehabilitation centre because they're addicted to some sort of drugs. In many other cases, they're victims of crime or sexual violence themselves and should be given therapeutic support to get them through life, which has put them in a situation which most of us cannot remotely imagine. So when you start to think about the realities of why people commit crimes, why they're in prison, you start to realize that putting people in prison dehumanizes individuals, it tattoos the word criminal across their forehead, and it creates entire zones of our society, communities up and down the country, and cities up and down this land, which are dehumanized by the criminalization of their young people, and they are disproportionately young black people or people from ethnic minority communities, and all of this is deeply counterproductive to our society. It is counter to the good and the well-being of our society, our people, our safety, and our basic duty to the young, because what we're talking about, this whole story is predicated on Keir Starmer having the barefaced gall as a politician and also a lawyer and former top prosecutor to have the barefaced gall to presume to have an opinion in public about the act of a judge sitting in a courtroom who's seen every piece of paper, who's read the psychological profiles of the defendants, who understands every single 360-degree angle of the case. And Keir Starmer, sitting there desperate to remain at number 10, is using this to pronounce upon as an issue in the criminal justice system, when our system is creaking at the seams, when our Crown courts are crammed to capacity, and he has proposed the abolition of jury trial for tens of thousands of people who have had that right for nearly 1,000 years. Okay, I've probably been talking enough. Do you have a question? I'm so sorry. I've gone on for a long time.
Well, what you just said was kind of what I was going to ask. What effect has the hollowing out of the police service, the closing of police stations, the loss of 20,000 experienced officers, 22,000 backroom staff, the closure of magistrates' courts, the defunding of the probation service and the overcrowding of jails after 14 years of austerity under the Conservative governments affected everything that we're talking about?
So this is where the Police Federation and I come into alignment, because the Police Federation represents officers who have been subject, and I've been working in the law of policing, not just the law of criminal law, but the law of policing. So I represent police officers who are accused of misconduct. I acted in the Hillsborough inquest on behalf of police officers. So for many, many decades, I've acted for police officers on the ground. I've worked with police officers at every rank. I've represented police officers at almost every rank, from constable to chief constable. And what I can tell you is this, that the police officers who try to discharge their public duties to the best of their ability have been treated appallingly by generation after generation of politicians, by government after government. They've been given targets and obstacles, and they've been given, one minute they've been given money to spend, next they've been told to abolish half your ranks, change the way you organise everything, make everything much more cost effective. And at the end of the day, what's happened to policing is is this: it's been utterly divorced from what the public want from police officers, which is very, very simple. When they are burgled, they want a police car to arrive with blue lights on when they ring them and say, my house has been burgled, it's been smashed to bits, my jewelry's been taken. What they don't want is to ring a call centre to be given a number so they can call their insurance company. And so police officers are not responsible for that. I'll tell you who is responsible for that: the politicians who have made sure that police resources are spent doing nonsense to clear up mental health problems, to clear up drug addiction problems, to clear up alcoholism problems in communities, to clear up domestic violence, to clear up a mixture of all of those things at the same time, when those police officers are not, that's not why we want the police. That's not what they're there for. What police officers are there for is to respond to violence, to respond to the invasion of your home, to respond to, physical or sexual assault, to respond to situations where you urgently need a police officer in a uniform to come to where you are and save you from peril. And until we return to a society that has police officers that can do that have the resources for that, and are not tied up with administrative crap for about 3/4 of their working lives, our criminal justice system and our society is in terminal decline.
One of the cases that precipitated our conversation was of Ryan Davis, who was a police officer. He was on plainclothes operation in Hereford when he was attacked by a father and son after he had tried to stop them from attacking somebody else. He suffered a broken leg, multiple fractures, dislocated broken ankle, face lacerations, damage to his eye. He's still suffering the results, the consequences of that now. And the two people, one was 49, father and son, still in jail 4 years and 3 months for assault. His son is out already. He was released after 82 days after it was decided that the almost 1 year that he had spent wearing a tag on bail before sentencing should count towards the total time served. And that is the case really that Brian Booth, I think, was referring to. It must be a bit disappointing, to say the least, for the police officer, even if it wasn't one of their own, to arrest and put through the court system a pair of people like this, and to see a judge hand out what to some people looks like a very light sentence, and that really is the basis of them thinking that judges are not really they're sort of not in touch with the reality that most people experience. What do you think of that?
Well, there's two different aspects. Firstly, what you're basically asking me to do is a Keir Starmer. You're asking me to say, okay, I have about 0.001% of information about what's in this case file, what the judge has available, the reports, the whole entire evidence base, the public interest considerations that have been taken, the sentencing guidelines, which are imposed by government, not by judges, all of the other elements, and including, in fact, the element you mentioned, which is supposedly counts that he was on. So the legislation says if you are on a electronic monitored curfew for more than 9 hours a day, that counts if you're eventually sentenced to a prison sentence as 50%. So for every single day you're monitored for a minimum of 9 hours. That's statute. That's the government that sets that law. That's not the judge. He doesn't have any choice, or she, to whether to apply that or not. So all of these things are extremely complex. They're extremely detailed, which is why we trust judges with all of the information in real time to make those decisions. And of course, sometimes they get them wrong, which is why we have a court of appeal, whereby the Attorney General can appeal a sentence which the Attorney General believes is unduly lenient, and then appeal court judges will once again have the opportunity to say, yes, maybe the judge was wrong. So the point is, there's a system in place to deal with all of that. And all I can say about this particular situation is, and my burning question is this: did this police officer attend this location on his own, or was he in a 2 police officer vehicle? Because if the answer is that he attended alone, and I'm only hypothesizing, but if he attended alone and this all happened because he didn't have another officer to back him up, then that is a fault of the exact system that I've been describing throughout the course of this interview. There should always be 2 officers attending a scene of potential violence, because a single officer alone is so vulnerable, and it is wrong that so many of them have to do so. And sadly, we've seen a number of them die because they attended in those circumstances. So that's a systemic problem that I'm afraid is an exact example of why politicians or commentators should say to themselves, actually, I don't have the full facts, and actually I need to think about this more deeply, but actually maybe it says something more about our society and the way we bay for blood, and we assume that the only form of justice is decades or a lifetime in prison, rather than maybe a burning realization that you've done something terribly wrong and your soul is crushed with guilt for the rest of your life. As I have to say, very, very many people who commit crimes find themselves in that situation. And do we just say, oh, tough? So send them away anyway. Who cares about their moaning and their whining or their so-called kind of, sudden feelings of grief and remorse? Well, okay, so let's just live in a binary world. Let's just say if you commit murder, you go to prison forever, or maybe you go to prison and you have no food, or maybe you go to prison and you just have the exact amount of food to keep you alive and you're in a tiny box. Where do you end up with all of this? Where do you end up? Before you say to yourselves, surely we should be looking ahead to a life where our society is positive, that we look for redemption, we look for goodness in people. We don't just we look to sort of send everyone off to prison forever for any transgression. Where did the idea of glass houses go? Where did, casting the first stone suddenly become a concept that none of us respect anymore?
Let me talk about the morale within the judiciary, because as you've described, armchair experts will second guess in the press a judge's decision. They'll be criticised for being out of touch. They've been labelled enemies of the people. Who would want to do a job like that now?
That's a good question, and not me is my first answer. I've no desire to be a judge, never have wanted to be a judge, but I think there are a number of reasons why people choose to be judges. One, and I think this is probably the majority, because they genuinely think it's a public service and a public duty, which yes, it comes with a degree of status, but it comes with huge responsibility to try to do the right thing for the public. So I think that's the majority of the colleagues amongst my legal colleagues who go on to become judges. I think the majority of them, that's the reason. I think for some, it's a badge. It's something they have a bit of an ego and they want some status. And there are definitely people in that category who apply for the judiciary. I think other people are very want to have a judicial career. So they want to start maybe in a more junior position and work their way up and potentially end up as a high court judge or a very senior judge, and they see that as a worthy and viable career path. But the one thing I don't think any of them do is go into the judiciary because they want to pursue a political or social or moral agenda. Because, I know judges, I've known many judges, many of them have political, moral, social agendas. And I don't think any of them take those into the courtroom. What people do take into the courtroom as judges is their background, who they are. And there's a problem, because our judiciary is incredibly narrow in terms of the social base from which it's drawn. So overwhelmingly privately educated, overwhelmingly from higher income families and a family of professional background and potentially even political connection, etc., and legal connection. And so overwhelmingly.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, but that does rather inform people's idea that they're out of touch.
Yeah, but not in the way that perhaps you think, because I think they're not out of touch with sentiment. So by out of touch, does that mean they don't understand that, there are radio programs like the one we're on now, or there are newspapers which they see when they fill their Bentley up with petrol? They don't really drive Bentley.
Well, I guess...
But they see the headlines. They know the public hate certain cases. They want... There are massive protests about sentences being too lenient, or people being let off, or judges being out of touch, or Brexit when it was the Supreme Court, and all of that stuff. And so, yes, they understand that people think the judiciary get things wrong. But I don't think, when they go into their courtrooms, I think they're informed by mostly good faith But in the background, of course, is, you know, how do we all decide what we do? How do you decide how to advocate on your program? Not necessarily advocate, but how do you decide, you know, how to challenge a guest, how to ask a question in a way that is kind of interesting for your guest, but also, you know, it reflects something about you as a journalist and you as an interviewer. Of course it does, and that's the same for judges. And the only thing you can try and do is ensure that all judges are properly and fully trained in the realities of life for people in this country, because I think that's the area where I think people who are in the judiciary can be divorced from reality, in the sense that the lived experience on the streets, the lived reality in our communities, you know, just think about the communities that are destroyed by drugs, by which I mean they're destroyed by prohibition, which is the real reason we have a drug problem and gang problem in this country, is because, like they had in the United States when they prohibited alcohol, we prohibited drugs because we were told to do it by Richard Nixon 50 years ago. We did it. We've created a massive heroin problem,
yes,
a huge crack problem.
Chris, I'm afraid I don't have time to go down that particular avenue.
I understand, yes, and not enough solutions.
Exactly. I do appreciate your time, though. Thanks for that. Chris Daw KC, criminal barrister at Millennium Chambers and author of the book Justice on Trial.